Good morning, I'm Tony Leeds. I'm the chair of the European Industry Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this web seminar in which we're going to look at the question of the potential use of total diet replacement for addressing the question of obesity and diabetes and other issues at the present difficult time of the pandemic, where we've seen obesity and diabetes alter the risk of development of more severe disease. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'm going to just run through some housekeeping issues. If we move to the next slide, please. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen to type in short questions, and we'll try to select from these at the end of each presentation. Please also complete the evaluation form at the end of the event. Registration is essential to obtain the SCOPE points for those of you who are registered to acquire World Federation of Obesity SCOPE points. So if you're looking over somebody's shoulder, you do need to register independently. We also aim to make the talks available afterwards, probably within 2 or 3 working days after the event. Move on to the next one, please. We're very fortunate this morning to have a panel of experts who have all been involved in obesity research over the years. Carel le Roux from University College Dublin, who's had major involvements in a number of big trials, but is also a leading individual in relation to the educational programs run by the World Federation of Obesity. Mike Lean, who's going to talk to us in a moment about the direct diabetes remission trial. Henning Bliddal from Frederiksberg Hospital in Copenhagen will talk to us about osteoarthritis in the elderly, in obese elderly. And then finally, Shahrad Taheri is going to present for us the DIADEM study, which looks at diabetes remission in non-European individuals. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So our aim this morning is to highlight the potential for total diet replacement programs to reduce future risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and of course to ameliorate the severity of existing diabetes, and indeed consider the possibility of achieving diabetes remission, to do so quickly, safely and cost effectively, and therefore to offer an option for consideration for the at-risk subgroups in the population who might be at risk of more severe outcomes in this present viral pandemic. Next slide, please. Before we move to the talks, for those of you who are not familiar with this type of intervention, I'm providing some definitions. These, of course, will be on the slide sequences provided to you after the event. Total diet replacement is food which is provided in formulated form for use in energy-restricted diets, where the formulated food replaces the whole of the daily diet. In other words, conventional food is removed. Of course, there's an enormous degree of flexibility, and some research centres have used total diet replacement plus some small amount of additional conventional food as well. But that's the formal definition in EU regulations. Then there is low-calorie diet, low-energy diet, 800 calories or above, up to 1,200 calories if it's a total diet replacement. Very low-calorie diet is defined quite clearly as 800 calories or less. You'll see that I've referred to portion numbers there. Of course, portion numbers vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. For the low-calorie diet, it's usually and often, but not always, 4 portions of products. And then finally at the bottom is the definition for meal replacement products, which are designed to replace 1 or 2 meals daily. And there are papers published in the literature which show that it is possible to achieve weight loss more slowly using 1 or 2 meal replacements per day. These products are usually 200 to 250 calories per portion. Next slide, please. How do they work? We may come to discuss this later on, but clearly there's a larger energy deficit of between 1,000 and 2,000 calories per day between what is provided in the diet and the amount that is required. And this compares and contrasts with the deficit that's usually achieved in a conventional reducing diet of 500 to 600 calories. This results in greater rates of weight loss, typically around 1.3 kilograms per week for women, 1.5 kilograms per week for men. But of course, there is enormous variation in how individuals respond to this. So these are the middle of the range values. One of the interesting issues is this: the type of diet does result in high compliance. If I take one example of the 8-week diet used in the preparatory phase of the 8-country pre-diabetes study that has already been published, at least the additional 8-week period, 91% of the individuals managed to complete that first 8-week total diet replacement intervention. So high compliance, and that is also reflected in relatively high compliance in other clinical trials as well. We know from a number of trials that good initial weight losses tend to predict better outcomes later on at 1 year and later. Others will comment on this. Years and years ago, the American Dietetics Association acknowledged the fact that there was a place for formula diet products in facilitating portion control, particularly for individuals who have a problem with portion control. And then finally, mechanisms, which we may or may not have time to touch on, but the very early suggestion that taking the energy intake down to a low enough level would result in a higher level of ketone bodies circulating in the blood, and this would have an appetite suppression effect. There's a little bit of experimental evidence for that in relation to reducing the ghrelin effect of energy restriction. We may or may not have time to talk about that. So we move on to the next slide, please. Nutrient composition is defined within regulations, and at the moment, the values given indicate that the typical products on the market would provide 60 to 80 grams for 600 to 800 calories, which would come out at 0.75 to 1 gram per kilogram. Carbohydrate at the level shown there. Essential fatty acids are defined within the regulations, and micronutrients, 100% for TDR and not less than 30% of the recommended intake for meal replacement products. You need to be aware that there is within the European community and the European Union an intention that the composition will change in 2 years' time, and I think Mike is going to talk a little bit about that in the future. So thank you very much. We will now move on to consider the first talk, in which Carel le Roux is going to consider obesity nutritional status and COVID-19.